I was last week with one of our major investors in our company is Al Gore, and he runs this generation fund, a little bit more long-term, so that interests me. And he asked me to talk to them. And on the way there, I actually came from the airport, and I saw 3 people talking to each other. And as you're normally not supposed to do, but always do, is listen into what they're talking about. I know you do, I do. And I quickly discovered that one of them was a doctor, one of them was an engineer, and one of them was an economist. And the doctor said, we have the oldest profession, because you go back to the book of Genesis, and Eve came out of the rib of Adam, and both of them survived, so that was a very successful operation. Doctors have the oldest profession. The engineer said, I don't think so. If you look at the universe, first there was chaos. We created the universe by creating order, and out of order came the universe. And if there's someone that can create order, it's engineers. So we have the oldest profession. And the economist said, I don't think so, because who created chaos in the first place? So anyway, it's great to be here, and certainly to give a lecture to such a distinguished audience. I'm a little bit humbled there, because I'm certainly not an expert in the field. And then on top of that, if you say that I'm the first businessman that comes and talks to you, I must be outright stupid. So I'm obviously a great admirer of what you're doing here at the Institute and at Imperial College. On the sites, actually, of the World Fair of 1851. So if something is built to last, and probably more sustainable, it couldn't be a better place to give that lecture. But what I'm also pleased about is that not only the work you do here, and certainly in the area of sustainability and climate change, but more importantly, also the way that you communicate that work. You communicate that to the business community, to the policymakers, to the media, to the young, and many of them are here tonight in the audience, and obviously they will hold us to account if we are successful or if we fail. I also know that whatever you do may often feel like a thankless task. It feels like that sometimes as we give a disproportionate amount of voice to the critics. Somehow the press seems to like that. And at times the gulf between the scientific realities and the public debate seems a little bit unbridgeable. But I just want to tell you that the work you're doing is absolutely vital, and that you certainly can take credit for the progress that is being made in many different areas. I'll talk about it, that frankly, without that would not have been possible. Now, there will always be cynics and skeptics. As CEO, I'm used to that as well, and what I've always told myself is to be more resilient as a result of that, so they have a role to play. But it was the writer Norman Cousins who actually said that cynicism amounts to intellectual treason, and perhaps it is the case. But this evening, I'm certainly pleased and humbled to be here with a little bit more intellectual rigor and hopefully intellectual curiosity. I want to just convince you of a few things, and perhaps I'm talking here to the converted, but there are 3 urgent and pressing facts. The facts which concern me as a businessman, but actually more importantly concern me as a father and a citizen of this earth just like you. And I certainly hope that they concern you as well. First is that our current collective response to climate change is frankly inadequate. And that's now threatening businesses, it's threatening jobs, and it's threatening the economy, both here in the UK, but also obviously the world at large. The second thing is that not only tackling climate change is consistent with economic growth, but as we work with the Climate Economy Project, as Brian said before, it's only by tackling climate change in a systemic way that we can actually deliver the growth that we need in our global economies. And thirdly, that we must seize the unprecedented opportunity, which is a very, very small window, in fact only over the next 2 years, where business, government and civil society absolutely has to come together to scale up with solutions to tackle some of these enormous problems that we have. But let me first start with a point on the inadequacy of the current collective response that we're seeing. And again, I know that you probably know most of the facts, but wherever you come from, if it's business or academics or government or NGOs, we've come together tonight, probably here in this lecture hall, because we share one simple thing in common. We're all alert to the threats that this world is facing. We're all inspired by the possibilities of what can be achieved. And we're all aware that we've reached a crossroad in human history. And I want to share with you why, despite all these many challenges that I talk about, there's never been a better time, in my opinion, to create a brighter future for all, including for those yet to come, for our children and, in fact, their children. It is actually incredible to think that we have a unique opportunity within our lifetime that none of us before has had, and perhaps if we do this well, none of us afterwards will have, is to have a window for about 15 years where we can irreversibly eradicate poverty in a more sustainable and equitable way. I don't know about you, but I want to be part of that. And with the work we did on the high-level panel for the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals, I've certainly come to believe that the time is now there. And it's not a coincidence that climate change negotiations and the post-2015 negotiations are actually happening simultaneously. And as you can expect, they're also closely linked. But all of that depends on the way we respond to one of the bigger challenges that probably is the single biggest challenge that we face, and that is climate change. Now, we need to talk about this as a future issue. We can, but the reality is it's already with us today. So it's now on our doorstep. So waiting is actually not anymore an answer. Extremes have become already the new normal in this world. In fact, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, I was there just a few weeks ago, has added a new color category to its weather maps after they've had a prolonged period of time of 54 degrees Celsius. Now, climatologists are also suggesting actually a new category number 6 on top end of the storm scale after the typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. The evidence is clear. The days of discussing of science are increasingly over, and time is certainly not on our sides. But also, I hope that you saw last week's IPCC report that came out. I'm still trying to digest that. They said they had an executive summary, and then I discovered it was 125 pages. But it certainly was another wake-up call, I hope, for all of you. The time is certainly not there anymore to hit the snooze button if anybody plans to do that. It shows that devastation that lies ahead, increasingly so, if we not act. In my own reading of the report, it's that climate change threatens actually all that we have achieved since the 60s in respect of poverty alleviation, food security, social stability. This world has made enormous progress. We've lifted 500 million people out of poverty. Globalization, for many, actually has been positive. But also, we're at a point that this half-century of progress that we've made could be wiped out in a lifetime earlier than our grandchildren. This is no longer just a moral case, but obviously also an economic one. When I say that we can't afford to not act, I literally mean that. In fact, we're at a tipping point, as we see so many cases. We recognize that for the first time, and this is purely in monetary terms, the cost of inaction is starting to become bigger than the cost of action. And this is a wonderful position to be in for businesses, because that actually galvanizes business. The moment when the cost of inaction becomes higher than the cost of action. And that is why in many situations you now see businesses moving ahead and probably setting standards higher than many governments are able to do. But this is more than macroeconomics, obviously. The new reality for businesses everywhere. Just in the last decade, we're just looking at some of these cost of inaction versus action. Just in the last decade alone, just according to the latest UN report from the Secretary General, an extra $2.7 trillion of costs were incurred as a result of disasters above the usual patterns. In fact, the OECD, Angel just put out a report where he predicts that by 2050, over 45 trillion of assets will be at risk if no action is taken. Accenture just published a study that said that just the supply chain issues that companies now face with these natural disasters can wipe potentially about 7% of the share value of these stocks. And just to complete the circle, I read a report from KPMG not long ago that the food industry, which is about half of our business, the food industry, could see its entire profits being wiped out by 2030 if no action is taken. Globalization, and obviously this just-in-time business model that increasingly is the order of the day, makes these volatilities and the speed with which these shocks travel the world even more relevant. Now, these examples that I just mentioned to you are only going to increase. The cost of inaction is continuing to go up the longer we wait. And these costs, frankly, are not just financial. If you're just financial, I think we can actually convince you with the rational part of it. But there's more to this. They impact the profit and loss accounts of businesses everywhere, and obviously they drive investment decisions and opportunities that we see. But they're also social and human. They are a threat to jobs. They are a threat to security. And actually they threaten increasingly people's everyday lives. And as you could expect, it affects the poor significantly more than the people in this audience. Now, we're seeing the effect of in Unilever on a daily basis as well. Our business operates in about 190 countries worldwide. Our supply chain, directly or indirectly, employs already 4 to 5 million people. But on top of that, we're in 7 out of 10 households globally, and we have about 2 billion people using our products on a daily basis. I can tell you, when you have that scope and scale of impact, then a disaster anywhere in the world is a disaster for us. It has nearly become a cynical joke that on a monthly basis we move from the floodings in the UK to extreme colds in the US, to the hurricanes in the Philippines, and so on. Shipping routes are cancelled because of intense weather patterns in the Philippines. Factories are closed because of extreme colds in the east coast of the US. Distribution networks are in disarray because of floods in the UK. And climate change obviously shows up enormously in the volatility of costs that affect our financial model. It shows up in the productivity of our factories. If there is no mau forest in Kenya, we won't have much tea from our tea plantations either. It even shows up in the water scarcity in many parts of the world, especially the Asian markets. It is already holding us back from growing. And it's showing up in our productivity and our own employees. Just a few weeks ago, when I was in China, we had to keep our employees at home because the pollution levels were simply too high. Natural disasters are already costing us money today. And we're estimating that the cost for a company like Unilever is about 300 million euros a year already now, and rising if we don't take action. Now, this is not surprising if you think that the extreme weather patterns have definitely become the new normal. Now, it's not all only for businesses like mine. I think many companies that I talk to have the same thing. And obviously, until recently, we assumed that markets would grow and people's incomes would always continue to rise. But if you do look at this new report that just came out from the IPCC, it tells us also that climate change actually increasingly is recreating again a new level of global poor. And they're not only just in the poor countries, they're also increasingly in the low and middle and high income countries where we start seeing this phenomena as well. Left unchecked, climate change has the potential to become a significant barrier to growth strategies, and not just for every company, also to growth strategies for economies. And again, the poor will be the ones that suffer most from that. Scarcity and volatility will continue to affect prices of raw materials. Business see increased pressure on profits, will stop making the necessary investments, and obviously reduce growth. In doing so, it will actually further exaggerate the tipping of the poor into poverty, or in some cases already pulling the middle class back in poverty as well. And we're seeing signs of this. Our forecast shows that consumers increasingly will have limited access to water, for example, already in many parts of the world. Some of our biggest markets like India, like China, or like Indonesia, increasingly a large proportion of our turnover will come from businesses in these water-stressed areas. Now, we did a study recently just by looking at India, in Mumbai and Delhi. In 2020, which is not that far off, there will be water availability gaps of about 45 to 90%. Without mitigation strategies, especially in Mumbai, we already see these affecting our business and our business growth this year and certainly moving forward already. This is not good news for my business if you don't take any actions. But it's a personal crisis, even more so for these families affected themselves. The OECD tells me that the other CEOs that I talk to tell me also that they increasingly face the same issues. So these challenges are real, they're clear, and they're extremely serious. And so must be our response. In fact, our response has to show our understanding of this fundamental truth first and foremost. It's a tremendously complex issue, and one of the reasons you might see less business people standing up here is in fact this complexity that we're dealing with. Not only is the tackling climate change compatible with economic growth, in my opinion, it is the only way that we are getting economic growth for the 21st century onwards. And once more, this climate economy report that we're putting out is trying to overcome this myth that some people try to put out there, that you cannot have growth and tackle climate change at the same time. The opposite is true. The good news is that more and more businesses are starting to work this out. We're starting to reach a tipping point in this transition, in my opinion, to the new economy. That if we can scale that, we would see tangible results for impact that would also surprise and hopefully galvanize our political constituency into a little bit more action. In fact, private capital is in increasing measures flowing into the low-carbon economy. Global investments in clean technology is now estimated to be over $300 billion a year, not an unsizable sum. The global low economy is now a 4 trillion economy, and it's growing at about 4 to 5% a year. In fact, during the crisis that we saw, and you take a torture region, the financial crisis, and you take a torture region like the European Union, it was the only industry that was actually growing. In fact, there's another industry, if I may divert for 1 second, that is the only other industry growing in Europe, and that's books on capitalism. Capitalism in crisis, new capitalism, capitalism reinvented, conscious capitalism. And to the point that I was flying back with my wife from a trip to India the other day, and I said, I'm going to write a book. And my wife said, don't do this, because any CEO that writes a book is usually out of office a year later. Because these books are sort of ego trips, you know, remember me for what I've done. But then I got an idea. I said, I'm going to write a book about capitalism. So she said, what are you going to call it? I said, I'll call it 50 Shades of Capitalism. So if you have any titles, any topics for any of the chapters, please send them to me. But more and more businesses obviously see that investing in a low-carbon economy is starting to make sense and want to be part of it. And the numbers actually support that. 75% of the world's largest companies now have multiple environmental and social goals in place. Most of them issue sustainability reports in one form or another. Many have integrated or internal carbon pricing even that they put into their business strategies. And the expectation that we finally one day will get external carbon pricing. We do the same actually, different hurdle rates for different projects. In fact, more than 50 of the top 200 companies have set carbon intensity reduction targets of more than 6%. And if you know from the Stockholm Resilience Center, it's the 6% that you need to stay within the 2-degree challenge. So they've actually gone beyond that, including my company. And individual companies obviously are doing amazing things as well. There's barely a day that you can't open the paper and see some news like Apple going 100% sustainable in power. And I don't know if you saw the question of Cook when he got it in one of his the last shareholder meeting actually, by one of the shareholders, how he could justify his investments in sustainable energy. And he simply said, if you don't like it, go and put your money somewhere else. I thought that was fairly courageous. Kingfisher, not just stopping the deforestation, but actually working actively on net reforestation. Nike, creating sustainable supply chains that are not only lean, but also green, equitable, as they call it, and empowered. IKEA, investing $4 billion in their furniture company in renewable energy infrastructures, and wanting to do that well before 2020. And in each case, it's not philanthropic. These are good business decisions. In fact, most of the companies that internalize climate change in their NPVs are getting a higher return. And increasingly, we can show that at a corporate level as well. Our own response in Unilever has been something what we call the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. We've set ourselves indeed a goal, as Brian said, to double our business, obviously, but to halve the environmental footprint. In fact, the only company of this scale and size that I'm aware of that has made this broad commitment or objective to decouple growth from environmental impact. On top of that, we want to help 1 billion people improve their health and well-being. We want to source 100% of our agricultural raw materials sustainable. And then, increasingly, we're looking at enhancing, obviously, the livelihoods of people across the value chain wherever we can. This is about changing the way we do our business, internally as well as externally. It also requires a longer-term model. That's why we stopped giving guidance, we stopped quarterly reporting, we changed our compensation system quite dramatically to put our word where our mouth is, and so far it's working for us. We've had the fastest growth in our industry. Interestingly, over 5 years the share price has doubled, so I also think that investors don't have anything to complain about. But at the same time, we're making great progress in partnership with many, undoubtedly many here in the audience as well, towards the enormous, audacious objectives we've set. 100% of our electricity in the US, Europe, Canada is already from certified renewable sources, and it's not costing us an arm and a leg. Since 2008, our manufacturing eco-efficiency programs have actually helped us cumulatively save about 300 million in terms of energy bills. We're reducing the impact of our logistics networks by 30–40%, very simply by reducing the normal things you would do, like truck mileage, lower emission vehicles, transport alternatives like rail and ship, and obviously building more efficient factories. All of our factories are LEED qualified now or run on zero waste, and obviously increasingly where we can, the green energy. In fact, we are using our size and scale of a company like this to see if we can speed up a little bit more market transformation, which is obviously far more fascinating, but also has a far bigger impact. One of the things that some of you might have seen is that we just issued a green bond in the UK of £250 million. In 3 hours, it was more than 3 times oversubscribed. And the money we will use only on projects that have a 50% water or 50% CO2 reduction. And frankly, we have plenty of those, even a company like ours. Now, one of our products is Ben & Jerry's. Next to our ice creams like Magnum and Cornetto. Now, one of the things we do on ice cream even, that is to make it a climate neutral model. And when I tell that to people, they are astonished because it's not exactly a product that is associated with climate free, but you can make that a climate neutral model. We are converting in the industry and ourselves taking the lead there. All of our ice cream cabinets, we have about 3 million of those in the world where you buy your ice creams from, to natural refrigerants or climate friendly ice cream, if you call it. They not only use less energy as a result, but obviously also have the HFCs are being replaced by natural refrigerants. And that's about 4% of global warming, by the way. Getting now others involved, like the Cokes or the Pepsis or the Nestle's, who equally have a lot of cabinets, is a very important part for us. And we're working with the European Union to actually phase out the HFCs in any type of freezer. Hopefully we can achieve that by 2020, if not 2022. So initiatives like that, where you can achieve the tipping point, are very important to us. Now, it's also clear that in some of the challenges that we have to deal with and are less in our control. So we need to look at these things a little bit differently. For example, the consumer and consumer behavior is not so easy to change. We're trying, but I have to say the speed that this is going is not to my liking. So we need to step up our own innovation programs to carry these consumers with us. More concentrated detergents, lower temperatures. You might have seen the new deodorants we've introduced in the UK, which is half the can and certainly 30% lower emission. Or the launch of our dried shampoos is actually one of our fastest growing parts of our business. So internalizing this in our innovation programs might accelerate some of that conversion also. But we also have to do it upstream from where we get our raw materials, with many of our people in the total value chain, where we have enormous opportunities to bring transformations to tackle this climate change. Now, a particular hobby of mine and a particular interest is deforestation. In fact, 15% of the global warming actually comes from deforestation. And when I say deforestation, since it's related to 15% global warming, I always use the word illegal deforestation. Because I have discovered that by using the word illegal, you can actually get more people to work with you than not. We should have called this whole climate change illegal climate change, and we probably would have solved it already. Now, it's a complex area, this whole area of deforestation, but we as a company have to take co-responsibility if you're in the food business, and if 50% of that deforestation is driven by the demand for food. By the way, just to give you an idea, in the next 30 years, we need to produce as much food as we've produced in the last 8,000 years. This is the further 2 billion people that are coming, many people being lifted out of poverty, changing their eating patterns. The demand on land will be enormous. Deforestation, obviously, we've lost already 30% of our global forests. And unfortunately, another 20% have been degrading. So this is an issue that we need to attack. Now, we created the Global Consumer Goods Forum of all the major retailers and manufacturers. And we made a commitment that we would not sell any products anymore that came from this illegal deforestation. Products like soy, beef, pulp, palm, paper. It's an enormous signal that sends from the demand side to the total value chain up to the producers in many of the countries. Our industry body that we've put together is about 4 trillion in sales. And that's obviously enough critical mass to do that. It's called the Global Consumer Goods Forum. We launched that in Cancun when we had the climate change agreements there, and we want to achieve that by 2020. In the case of Unilever, we will be doing that by 2015, and on some of the ingredients, it is already earlier. Now, it's not an easy thing to do because it requires a broad coalition. You take palm oil, for example. You have major palm oil producers like Malaysia or Indonesia that depend on that for a livelihood. So one of the things is the suppliers. Fortunately, we have a very courageous supplier that is called Wilmar, who agreed to the no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation policy that we've put out. And the fortunate thing is that Wilmar is about 45% of the palm oil market. So getting producers like Wilmar on board and then hopefully 2 or 3 others which are now coming along creates that tipping point. And I think that's very much the future. But we can also not do it alone with the industry. We need the governments as well. In this case, the government of Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. And that's why we created what is called the Tropical Forest Alliance. The Tropical Forest Alliance is a coalition of major countries like the US, the UK here, the Netherlands, not surprisingly, Norway, Indonesia, and actually Liberia is part of that because Mrs. Sirleaf was part of my high-level panel. And they've all made commitments to say we're going to help in that transition. We're now getting the World Bank involved, just financing from many different organizations. In fact, increasingly, we're getting the banking sector involved. As many of you know in the audience, the banking sector is desperately looking for a soul. And I think we're providing them here with one by simply saying, just only lend your money to people that are involved in sustainable activities and don't lend your money anymore to any of the other ones. And they created the Banking Environment Initiative. Anthony Jenkins from Barclays is a very enthusiastic leader of that. And they issued what is called the Soft Commodity Pact. So I think with that, we can get even the financial sector on board. And I'm giving you all these details because it gives you the example of these new tripartisan partnerships that you need to create, focusing on that with the right players. You don't need that many, in my opinion, to get to these tipping points to make this a better world for all. And it's actually happening everywhere. It's happening in the UN when Ban Ki-moon calls for a zero hunger challenge. It calls for sustainable agriculture as part of that, or attacking food waste. Food waste, by the way, 11% of global warming, if you believe it or not. Or it's happening with other efforts like the B Team that we're just trying to create under the initiative of Richard Branson. Individuals are increasingly taking the initiative to bring the right people together to arrive at these tipping points that I talked about. One of the efforts I'm involved in and honored to chair is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Last November in Istanbul, when we had our annual meeting, we launched what is called Action 2020. We have now selected in and selected out others. With Americans in the audience, I'm told never to use the word progressive because that's seen as negative. Here in Europe, I like that. But I have to use forward-thinking companies. So we have about 200 forward-thinking companies for Americans in the audience that have actually committed to be part of what the world could look like in 2050 with a specific thing which is called Action 2020. And the commitment is to accelerating innovation towards business solutions like electrifying cities or carbon capture and storage or using forests as carbon sink and many of the other things. It's improving the business case for obviously implementing these things by better understanding the risks and current impacts. Coalitions around integrated reporting and other things would be part of that. And it's collaborating, the most important thing, with sectors, with value chains and with governments to ensure that national or international policies obviously support what we're trying to achieve here. This week is actually their annual meeting with all of the members, so 200 member companies will be in Montreux. Companies like Apple or Vodafone or Siemens or Toyota will meet for 3 days there to see how on each of these areas of focus under Action 2020 they can get to these tipping points by working together globally and cross-industry. So I'm very excited about that. And obviously climate change is one of the major opportunities that is firmly on the corporate agenda of any of these companies. In fact, the World Business Council is part of the climate summit that is happening in September in New York as one of the credible voices of business. And they're starting to unite their voices, which is the good thing. A voice that speaks increasingly actually even louder than our political leaders, unfortunately. A voice that says increasingly, we are doing it, so can you. And they must. Without the right policy frameworks in place, frankly, and political signals, even the most determined individuals, even the most determined businesses like ourselves or the ones represented in the World Business Council can only get so far. You cannot solve all these issues. We do need these frameworks and we do need these policy signals. Now this brings me to the third and most compelling point probably, and that is that in the next 2 years we have an unprecedented opportunity to actually work together to scale some of these business actions and others I talked about and get this political commitment that we're all looking for. Now, I attended the World Economic Forum in Davos early this year, and I was actually fairly positive. I thought it was one of the best ever meetings that I've been at, not the least because a whole day was actually scheduled on climate. In fact, 2 days. We had another day after that was the climate economy, but a whole day Klaus Schwab dedicated to climate change. And that's quite unique. And the question that CEOs and world leaders that were there were increasingly more pertinent. And obviously the most famous question is, if the case for action is actually so obvious, why isn't it already happening at scale? Now, I thought about it many times, and I think the answer is pretty simple. It's about policy and investment at the same time that are probably the same or two different sides of the same coin. Policy and investment. If we can just overcome that last hurdle, I think you'll really get to these tipping points. Consider what is happening right now if you look at it. If you're honest with yourselves, we'll admit that too many people who still influence the financial flows around the world, the people who decide where money would flow, if it is into tar sand, or if it into solar, or if we should put it into airports, or if we should put it into high-speed rails, are unconvinced, frankly, that the low-carbon transition is actually going to happen, at least with their investment horizon. If you have a very short investment horizon, but still is the case with the majority of the financial community, then the traction is not as high as it should. So that just doesn't work yet to the full extent as we want it to be. So what you see is continuing flows of capital actually are going into the high capital carbon investments that push us towards this cliff edge that I talked about of irreversible and disastrous climate change that we're dealing with. Now, low carbon investments do take place, but simply not enough. And certainty to invest there at scale is one of the, or the lack of certainty, is one of the main reasons why we don't see these investments coming in at the speed that we need them. Now, some investors are undoubtedly working up to the risk, and some of the financial or investor community is starting to exert its own pressure on the financial markets to take a little bit of a longer-term perspective. That's positive, and we need to encourage that. One of the examples is the carbon disclosure projects, challenging companies to disclose their direct carbon impact. And also, if you have indirect impacts, lobbying on energy and climate policy and all these things. In fact, Climate Disclosure Project represents about 720 institutional investors that now have $87 trillion of assets under investment. And they have increasing influence with that type of money, and that's a good thing, and that influence is starting to show. In fact, I was very encouraged to see Shell's latest financial report, which warned shareholders for the first time actually, that the company needs to explore economically viable and publicly acceptable ways to reduce carbon emission or face a downturn in business. And this is a major oil company. You will have closely watched perhaps the latest victory in some of the big investor companies divesting from the energy sector. The last one was the Nordic investor house Storebrand. It excluded actually from its portfolio 19 fossil fuel companies. And it ditched these companies in what they called in pursuit of long-term, sustainable and stable returns. Now, like the letter written a few months ago by a coalition of institutional investors that represented 3 trillion of assets under management, which they wrote to 45 companies, and they were simply asking them, can you, when you publish your results, calculate the risk of plowing billions of your dollars into new oil, gas and coal projects, when you probably know, increasingly so, that half of these investments that you make, or half of these investments that you account on in your balance sheet, can probably not be commercially viable anymore. So pressure is growing from all different angles. But the tipping point is still a little bit off, and that's where the policy comes in. Investing in high carbon models for many of the financial community is still what I call the emperor's new clothes. Sometimes it's easier to just simply pretend that the value is there even when it's not, because to acknowledge really the reality would be for many people still too uncomfortable. But if we get the clear signal from governments, if we get a step up in the policy framework decisions, I think we can move. Now, leaders around the world have committed to keeping the global temperature to below 2 degrees already. That is a given. In fact, one of your colleagues here, John Ashton, he also teaches here at the Institute, has had very clear what this means. In fact, if you commit to the 2 degrees, just for people to be clear, it means taking carbon emission out of the energy system of all major economies. And within little more actually than 1 generation. So that's the task that we really have to set ourselves if we want to be below the 2 degrees. And I'm not so sure that our policymakers understand the significance of that or the urgency of that. Now, we know this is feasible. We certainly have the technologies and the capital to do that. What we really now need, once more, is the political will. And that requires a transformation. It's much more benign transformation, actually, to do that now than to deal with the unmitigated climate change consequences that we otherwise would get. And it requires us to put ourselves, obviously, on a different path. Now, the current path, despite the fact that everybody agrees on the 2%, the current path that all the governments are on, according to the many studies and what you've participated in, is that is a 4 to 6% degree. And that should be enough, you would think, to internalize these cost of inactions in their local economies for these governments and to start to take significant action. And that's obviously one of the things that we want to focus on now. And that's exactly what the work is on the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, to really target these governments into a little bit more heroic action. And Felipe Calderon, who is chairing this task force, the former president of Mexico, fortunately is passionate about that. And hopefully we can get through to the right decision makers that I talked about. Now, policy ambiguity raises the cost of capital to investors anywhere. And politicians need to understand that if they're not clear on what these frameworks are, these investments will not be made. That's one of the main reasons why you see the bulk of these investments still go in these high carbon projects. Politicians have to mandate these low carbon investments. And if they don't, it actually becomes more and more expensive. Indecision here, in my opinion, is the highest expense we're paying. And it will end our chances, obviously, of limiting the global temperature rises the longer we wait. That's not safe, that's not sensible, and that's not for the climate nor for the economy. Now, looking at it the other way, and looking at it positively, where we see the certainty on policies, a country like Denmark would be a good example, in my opinion. It actually drives investments, it de-risks, it creates jobs, it attracts increasingly R&D. In fact, the green economy in the UK now, and you saw that this morning in the Financial Times, is basically the companies, the Nordic companies, that see it perfectly viable as great investments here because they already have this R&D and know-how to make this a viable business model. They've understood that it delivers savings, that if you plow them back even further in the decarbonization agenda, it will create this virtuous circle of growth. It's definitely the future we can create here is definitely that future that we want. Now, the governments have to believe that by doing so will be enormous economic benefits. And they have to believe that the people that, or the countries that pioneer it will actually reap these rewards. They have to believe that if they continue to invest in high carbon, their investments will not be fully protected when these assets are stranded by policies, regulatory chains, etc. That's why this policy uncertainty that we still see, frankly, in the UK or in the EU to some extent, is so enormously damaging. I was in Brussels last week, and again on the 40% reduction or the 27% recycling. Yeah, we'll do a European target, but we don't hold the countries accountable. Perhaps we shouldn't do the target. We have a new commission in October. Let's wait again. Let the others solve it. Enormously damaging these positions to the global economy. And the more we can do to hold our politicians again accountable, the better it's off. One of the things we can do is the opportunity we have on the climate change agreements that are going on. As you well know, we have this year the COP20 in Lima, which is in November. In fact, in September, we have the climate summit in New York. We have in May already the first attempt in Abu Dhabi. And then we need to go to the climate change agreements in what is called the COP21 in Paris in November next year. The reality, though, is we need to come to an agreement this year. If we don't have everything nailed down, we won't have an agreement in Paris. So the September summit and the meeting in Peru are of absolute importance. And what we need to do is obviously rally enough people around that goal of making it challenging enough and keeping our politicians accountable. The Prince of Wales will be issuing a statement, I think it's probably this week, to put further impetus on this process, which he calls the trillion-ton communique. You know the trillion-ton thing, that we, in order to stay to the 2 degrees, we need to limit the total emission to about 1 trillion tons. Signatures are being circulated from as many people as possible over the next 18 months in the run-up to Paris. And I encourage you, if you have any sway in this, that you should sign up or demand business leaders and others to sign up. But also others are starting to take action and understand it. We see increasingly the US government to be interested. Interestingly, John Kerry, a man I admire, who has a lot of things on his mind, certainly now with the geopolitical tension in the world. By the way, a lot of it traces back to climate change, but that's a different topic. But a lot of the geopolitical tensions take enormous amounts of his time, like Syria or Ukraine. But he said to me that most of the meetings he has with the heads of state, climate change is now on the agenda. Climate change is on the agenda. In fact, if you don't believe him, look at the speech he did a few weeks ago in Jakarta when he was in Indonesia, and the Indonesian ambassador were fortunate enough to have with us here tonight. You see it also with actually in the US as well, where the word climate change, you were often associated with a communist or at least a very left-wing socialist. Now, being a Dutchman, I can handle a lot of things, so it never touched me. But increasingly, you have the business community speak out. You have business, a broad coalition of businesses asking for a price on climate, on carbon. You have now a series in the, what's your newspaper there, USA Today. I don't know if it merits the title newspaper. But USA Today ran a year-long series on climate change that would have been totally impossible if you would have thought about it before. The Obama administration, with the obviously the Environmental Protection Agency, has now pushed through requirements to cut 2.2 billion tons of CO2 emission, which basically rules out new coal-fired plants. And we see the same thing happening in other countries. I was in China not long ago, where frankly in Shanghai, you cannot see the other side of the street, and pollution levels are becoming incredibly dangerous. In fact, life expectancy between the industrial east of China and the south west of China is now 5.5 years difference. And with this internet Even the Chinese citizens are discovering that, and they're demanding changes. And not surprisingly, China is in fact one of the most progressive ones in taking actions, if you like it or not. They have 11 large-scale carbon capture storage projects that are in the planning or in the construction states already. And they announced a certain cap on coal consumption. They're making structural choices towards this energy transition as fast as they can. In fact, we bought just recently another water business because I think it's very good, increasingly so, to be sure that people get clean drinking water at home. And that's a business enormously growing in China as well, as they get enormously water stressed. In my visit in Shanghai, that became very clear again, where 25 to 40 times the WHO recommended limits of particles were already in the air. It's not a pretty picture to be there. But China is investing very simply because the water supply is running out, because people are complaining, because the only way to keep the system growing is economic growth, and these environmental constraints are becoming the biggest bottlenecks in this growth. We used to say that Europe was the vanguard of driving to a low carbon economy, but increasingly you have to look in other parts of the world as well. Sure, Europe has set standards for cars and emission standards that will hopefully become global standards, but increasingly you see other parts of the world also taking the lead, and China is certainly part of that. Carbon emission trading is now being proposed in China for the first time. And not on a small scale, by the way. The carbon emission trading in China covers about 20% of its emission and about 26% of the area of GDP. So it's on its way, and we need to help get to these tipping points. COP Paris next year hopefully results in the changes that we're looking for, hopefully results in the confidence that our politicians will see through, that their commitments have to be translated into actions for once. Hopefully we see Paris being a rule-based regime on top of intentions that will unleash a new level of carbon investment that we have not seen before. And again, we need our politicians to understand that. And I also hope that it will send a clear signal once more that the world is committed to establishing together effective systems in reducing and managing this climate risk. And that finally our politicians rise to this challenge of putting the common good ahead of each country's own individual interest. I believe honestly that it can be done, and I certainly will put all my energy towards putting that pressure on the system. But we also need the academic community that you're here. Obviously the academic community has enormous credibility, and despite the attacks that you're facing, keep up the excellent work. Decisions have to be informed by science, not newspaper headlines. Don't worry about that. So please have the courage to continue to tell it straight, and don't feel threatened by this minority that gets the majority voice sometimes. Those are the few punches that you can handle that come with this controversy. For my part, I will continue to carry your conclusions into the boardroom, certainly in my boardroom, but I will also try to do that with other business leaders. And I will continue to argue that we need to lead by example in our own organizations. We use our leverage in politics to make it easier for governments, and also give them some encouragement that indeed increasingly the majority of responsible business is behind them. So take some risk away. And then we need to rally and continue to rally civil society, students, youth movements. Half of the world outside of Europe and the US is below 25 years old. That's the young generation. They understand that they're 50% today, but they also understand that they're 100% tomorrow. So the more that we can rally them around this agenda, I think the better we're off. So in closing, let me say, whatever your age, whatever your background, whatever your jobs, let's make sure that those who hold the sway over our future are not asleep at the wheel, not in New York, not in Lima, and not in Paris, and that they're rising to that responsibility that we expect from any of our politicians. It certainly has never been a better time to create a brighter future for all, but we need them as well behind us. And if I can end simply by saying what Gandhi said, that the future actually depends on what you do in the present. So thank you very much.